The storm clouds rolled over the small, secluded village as if summoned by an unseen force. Rain battered rooftops and dirt roads, turning the streets into muddy streams. 8-year-old Lily sat in the dimly lit living room, her frail body propped against the worn-out cushions of an old armchair. Her face was pale, her breath shallow, and her small hands trembled as she clutched her favorite book. The doctors had given her parents little hope. Her illness had proven resistant to every treatment they tried. Medicine, it seemed, had reached its limits. But Lily wasn't entirely alone in her struggle. Curled up beside her, radiating warmth and steadfast loyalty, was Max, her golden retriever. Max wasn't just a pet. He was her protector, her confidant, and her best friend. His deep amber eyes seemed to understand more than mere commands. They held a wisdom that surpassed human comprehension. Max had been by her side since she was a toddler, and now, as she faced her darkest days, his presence was her only comfort. "Max," Lily whispered, her voice weak but affectionate. She reached out a hand to ruffle his fur, but her strength gave out halfway. Max nudged her hand gently with his nose, his tail thumping against the floor in a rhythmic reassurance. "You're my hero, you know that?" Outside, the storm intensified. Lightning illuminated the room in brief, eerie flashes, and thunder growled like a warning from the heavens. Max's ears perked up, his body tensing as if sensing something amiss. He stood, his posture alert, and padded to the window. His growl was low and guttural, a sound Lily rarely heard from her usually gentle companion. "What is it, Max?" Lily asked, struggling to sit upright. Her curiosity was piqued despite her exhaustion. She followed his gaze to the window, where the shadows of the storm danced across the glass. At first, she saw nothing unusual. But then, a flicker of movement in the garden caught her eye. A dark silhouette loomed just beyond the fence, too large and deliberate to be a stray animal. Fear prickled at the edges of her mind. She reached for her phone to call her parents, but it was dead. The storm had knocked out the power earlier that evening, and her phone's battery had drained hours ago. The house was eerily quiet except for the sound of the rain and Max's low growl. "Stay here," Lily said instinctively, though her voice was barely more than a whisper. Max ignored her, moving to the door instead. His body was a tense coil of energy, ready to spring into action. He barked, once, twice, sharp and loud, cutting through the storm's cacophony. The figure outside froze, then began moving again, this time toward the house. Lily's heart raced. She didn't know who or what was out there, but the deliberate approach of the shadowy figure filled her with dread. She tried to call out for help, but her voice failed her. Max, however, needed no further prompting. He bolted to the door and pawed at it, his growls escalating into ferocious barks. Lily's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. Her gaze landed on the heavy iron fire poker by the hearth. Summoning every ounce of strength she had, she forced herself to stand, swaying as she grabbed the makeshift weapon. The door rattled as the figure outside tried the handle. It was locked, but the old wooden frame wouldn't withstand much force. Max's barking became deafening, a primal sound that seemed to shake the very walls of the house. Lily clutched the fire poker tightly, her knuckles white with fear and determination. "Go away," she shouted, finding her voice at last. It was hoarse and shaky, but it carried a surprising amount of resolve. "I'll call the police." The rattling stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a voice, low and gravelly, responded from the other side of the door. "Open up, kid. I'm not here to hurt you." Lily's grip on the fire poker tightened. She didn't believe him for a second. Max's growls only grew louder, his body pressed against the door as if he could hold it shut with sheer willpower. "Leave us alone," Lily shouted again. Her voice cracked, but her determination did not. The man outside sighed audibly. "Suit yourself," he muttered. Then, with a sudden violent crash, he kicked the door. The old wood splintered, the lock giving way under the force. Lily stumbled back, her fragile body trembling as the man stepped inside. He was tall and broad-shouldered, clad in a dark, rain-soaked jacket. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood, but his presence radiated menace. Lily froze, paralyzed by fear, but Max sprang into action. With a fierce snarl, he lunged at the intruder, his teeth bared and his powerful jaws aiming for the man's arm. The man yelped in surprise, staggering back as Max's teeth sank into his sleeve. He swung his arm wildly, trying to shake the dog off, but Max held firm. The intruder cursed, his free hand fumbling for something in his pocket. Lily's eyes widened in horror as she saw the glint of a knife. "No!" she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. She raised the fire poker and swung it with all her might. The iron connected with the man's shoulder, and he cried out in pain, dropping the knife. Max released his grip, only to reposition and lunge again, this time knocking the man off balance. He fell to the floor with a heavy thud, Max's teeth still snapping dangerously close to his face. The man's hood slipped off, revealing a scruffy, weathered face twisted in rage. He shoved Max away with all his strength, scrambling to his feet. But before he could make another move, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Red and blue lights flashed through the rain-soaked windows, illuminating the chaos inside. The intruder cursed again, more loudly this time. He shot Lily a venomous glare before turning and bolting out the door. Max barked after him, his body poised to give chase, but Lily called him back. "Max, stay!" she commanded, her voice firm despite her trembling. Max obeyed, returning to her side and pressing against her leg as if to shield her from any remaining danger. Moments later, the police burst through the broken doorway, their weapons drawn. Lily collapsed to the floor, her strength finally giving out. Max lay beside her, his body tense but his eyes watchful. One officer knelt beside Lily, checking her over. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his tone gentle but urgent. Lily shook her head weakly. "Max saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tears streamed down her face as she clung to her loyal companion. He saved my life." The officer glanced at Max, who was still growling softly at the shattered doorway. He gave the dog a nod of respect. "Good boy," he said quietly. Then, turning to his colleagues, he added, "Let's find this guy. He won't get far in this weather." As the police fanned out into the storm, Lily leaned against Max, her exhaustion overwhelming her. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain: Max was more than just her faithful companion. He was her guardian, her hero, and the reason she was still alive. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a new question gnawed at the edges of her mind. Who was that man, and why had he targeted her home? And more importantly, had this night truly ended, or was it just the beginning of something far more dangerous? The storm had passed, leaving the village drenched in the aftermath. The air was heavy with the scent of rain and churned earth, and faint traces of dawn began to creep over the horizon. Inside the house, Lily was safe for the moment, cradled in her mother's arms as paramedics checked her vitals. Her father spoke in hushed, frantic tones to the police officers, recounting every detail of the horrifying encounter. Max lay at Lily's feet, his amber eyes flicking between each person in the room, his body still tense despite the calming voices around him. He hadn't let his guard down, not yet. "We'll patrol the area," one officer assured Lily's father. "If the intruder is still nearby, we'll find him. But for now, make sure the house is secure and don't hesitate to call us if anything else happens." Lily's father nodded, his jaw tight with barely contained fury. He couldn't believe someone had dared to invade his home, to threaten his family. But as much as anger boiled within him, he was also deeply grateful for Max. The dog had risked everything to protect Lily, and that loyalty was something he would never forget. As the officers left, Lily's mother guided her back to the armchair and wrapped her in a thick blanket. "You need to rest, sweetheart," she said softly, brushing a strand of damp hair from her daughter's face. "The doctors warned us about overexerting yourself." "I'm okay, Mom," Lily replied, though her voice was still weak. She reached down to scratch Max behind the ears. "Max is here. He'll keep me safe." Her mother forced a smile, but worry lingered in her eyes. She didn't want to alarm Lily, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over her. Who was that man, and why had he targeted their home? It felt too deliberate to be a random burglary. Max, however, seemed to sense that the danger wasn't entirely gone. He paced the house restlessly, sniffing at doors and windows, his ears swiveling at every creak and rustle. His instincts told him something was still out there, lurking in the shadows. Hours later, as the sun climbed higher into the sky, the house settled into an uneasy calm. Lily had finally drifted off to sleep, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Her parents took turns keeping watch, unwilling to leave her side for even a moment. Max lay beside her chair, his head resting on his paws but his eyes never fully closing. It was during this fragile moment of peace that a soft knock sounded at the front door. Lily's father stiffened, exchanging a wary glance with his wife. "Stay here," he whispered, grabbing the heavy flashlight he'd kept by the couch since the previous night's attack. He approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. Outside stood an older man in a police uniform, his face weathered and serious. "Morning," the officer said when the door cracked open. "Sorry to bother you, but I've got some updates on last night's incident." Lily's father hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let the officer in. "Any news?" he asked, his voice tight with anxiety. The officer nodded, glancing around the room. His eyes lingered on Max, who had risen to his feet, his posture alert but non-aggressive. "You've got a brave dog there," the officer remarked. "He's the reason your daughter's alive this morning. You should be proud." "We are," Lily's mother said, her voice shaking slightly. "But what about the man? Did you catch him?" The officer's expression darkened. "Not yet," he admitted. "But we found his trail. He cut through the woods behind your house and headed toward the old quarry. It's a dangerous area, especially after the storm. We're sending a team to search, but I have to warn you, this guy's not just some petty thief. He's been linked to a series of break-ins across the region, and he's known to be violent. Until we have him in custody, I'd advise you to stay on high alert." Lily's father's grip tightened on the flashlight. "We will," he said firmly. As the officer left, the unease in the house deepened. Lily's parents double-checked every lock and window, reinforcing the front door with a wooden beam. But despite their precautions, Max remained restless. He stood by the back door, his nose pressed to the crack where the door met the frame. His tail was low, his body tense. Something was out there. He could feel it. That night, the air was thick with tension. The family huddled together in the living room, the soft glow of a lantern casting long shadows on the walls. Lily's parents took turns keeping watch while Max alternated between pacing the room and lying at Lily's feet. The hours crawled by, each one more oppressive than the last. Around midnight, Max's ears perked up. He rose to his feet, his body rigid as a low growl rumbled in his throat. Lily's father immediately reached for the flashlight, his heart pounding. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Max didn't respond. Instead, he moved toward the window, his growl intensifying. Lily stirred in her chair, her eyes fluttering open. "Max," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "What's wrong?" Before anyone could answer, a loud crash shattered the silence. The back door splintered inward, and a shadowy figure burst into the room. It was the intruder, soaked, disheveled, and more desperate than ever. In his hand was a crowbar, and his eyes were wild with fury. "You think you can stop me?" he snarled, his gaze darting between the family members. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Lily's father stepped forward, brandishing the flashlight like a weapon. "Get out of my house," he said, his voice steady despite the terror gripping him. "Leave now, or I swear you'll regret it." The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Big words," he sneered. "But I didn't come here to talk." Before he could take another step, Max launched himself at the intruder. The golden retriever moved with astonishing speed and precision, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's arm. The crowbar fell to the floor with a clang as the man howled in pain, trying to shake Max off. "Get him, Max!" Lily cried, her voice filled with both fear and fierce pride. The man stumbled backward, crashing into the coffee table and sending shards of glass flying. Max held on, his growls feral and unrelenting. Lily's father seized the opportunity to grab the crowbar, raising it high. "Stop!" the man yelled, his voice cracking. "Call off the dog. I'll leave. I swear." But Max didn't relent. He seemed to sense that this was no idle threat, that the safety of his family depended on his actions. Finally, the man managed to break free, shoving Max away with all his strength. He scrambled to his feet, blood dripping from his arm, and bolted for the door. "Stay back!" Lily's father shouted, advancing with the crowbar. Max gave chase, his bark echoing through the night as the intruder disappeared into the darkness. Lily's mother called the police, her hands shaking as she relayed the events in a rush of words. When Max finally returned, his fur was matted with mud, and his sides heaved with exertion. He limped slightly but held his head high, his tail wagging weakly as he approached Lily. She threw her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. "You did it, Max," she whispered. "You saved us again." But even as the family embraced their loyal guardian, a chilling thought lingered in the back of their minds. The intruder had escaped, and the nightmare wasn't over yet. The shadows still held secrets, and Max knew better than anyone that the danger was far from gone. The night stretched endlessly, the air thick with a residue of fear. Despite their best efforts to secure the house, the family could not shake the feeling that the intruder would return. Every creak of the old wooden floor and every rustle of wind against the windows sent shivers down their spines. Max lay by the door, his body taut with vigilance, ears twitching at the faintest sound. His amber eyes burned with a fierce determination. He would not let his guard down. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of gold and pink, Lily woke with a start. The nightmares of the previous night still clung to her, a tangle of shadowy figures and cold, menacing laughter. She looked down at Max, who lifted his head and wagged his tail faintly. "Good boy," she whispered, stroking his fur. But even as she tried to reassure herself, a gnawing feeling of unease persisted. The intruder's words haunted her. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Downstairs, Lily's parents were already up, their faces lined with exhaustion. Her father was on the phone with the police again, demanding updates. "How can he just vanish?" he growled. "He's injured. There should be blood, tracks, something." "We're doing everything we can," the officer on the other end replied. "We've expanded the search radius, but this guy knows the terrain. It's possible he's hiding somewhere remote." Somewhere remote. Lily's mind drifted to the old quarry the police had mentioned the day before. It was a sprawling expanse of jagged rocks and dense forest, abandoned years ago and left to decay. It was the perfect place for someone to disappear. By mid-morning, Lily's father decided to take matters into his own hands. "We can't just sit here," he declared, pacing the living room. "What if he's watching us right now, waiting for another chance? We need to find him before he comes back." "You can't go after him," Lily's mother protested. "It's too dangerous. Let the police handle it. They've had a full day and nothing to show for it," he shot back. "I'll take Max. He's already proven he can handle himself." At the sound of his name, Max perked up, his tail wagging slightly. He seemed to understand the weight of what was being discussed. Lily stepped forward, her small frame trembling but her voice steady. "I want to come too." "Absolutely not," her father said firmly. "You need to stay here, where it's safe." "But Max might need me," she argued. "What if something happens to him?" Her father hesitated, torn between his protective instincts and the bond he knew Lily shared with Max. Finally, he relented. "Fine. But you stay close to me, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understand?" Lily nodded, her heart pounding. She felt a mix of fear and determination as they prepared to leave. Her mother packed a small bag with essentials, water, a flashlight, a first-aid kit, while her father grabbed the crowbar and a sturdy walking stick. Max stood by the door, his posture alert and ready. The quarry loomed before them like a gaping wound in the earth. The path leading to it was overgrown, the trees twisted and menacing. The storm from the previous night had left the ground muddy and treacherous, slowing their progress. Lily clutched her father's hand tightly, her eyes darting to every shadow. Max led the way, his nose low to the ground as he sniffed for a trail. Every so often he would pause, his ears swiveling toward an unseen sound. The forest was eerily silent, the usual chorus of birds and insects absent. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. As they reached the edge of the quarry, Max stopped abruptly, his body stiffening. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Lily's father tightened his grip on the crowbar, scanning the area. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Max didn't respond. Instead, he moved forward cautiously, his nose working furiously. Lily and her father followed, their footsteps muffled by the wet earth. The quarry was a desolate landscape of crumbling rocks and rusted machinery, the remnants of its former life scattered like bones. They were halfway across the clearing when Max suddenly barked, a sharp, urgent sound. Lily's father froze, his eyes dotting around. "Where?" he hissed. Before Max could move, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the intruder, his arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage. His face was pale, his eyes wild. In his hand was a knife, the blade glinting in the faint sunlight. "You should have stayed home," he snarled, his voice low and menacing. "Now you've made it worse for yourselves." Lily's father stepped in front of her, raising the crowbar. "Stay back," he warned. The man laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "You think you can stop me? You don't even know what I've been through." Max growled, baring his teeth. His fur bristled, and his stance was low and aggressive. He was ready to spring at a moment's notice. The tension was unbearable, the air crackling with the promise of violence. "Lily, run," her father said quietly, his voice shaking. "Now." But before she could move, the man lunged. Max exploded into action, intercepting him mid-charge. The two collided with a sickening thud, the knife clattering to the ground. Max bit down on the man's injured arm, drawing a howl of pain. "Get off me!" the man screamed, flailing desperately. But Max held firm, his growls deep and feral. Lily's father rushed forward, kicking the knife out of reach and striking the man's shoulder with the crowbar. The intruder collapsed to the ground, winded and defeated. "Dad!" Lily cried, running to Max. She grabbed his collar, pulling him back. "It's okay, boy. He's done. You did it." Max released his grip, panting heavily. His muzzle was stained with blood, but his eyes were calm as he looked at Lily. Her father quickly tied the man's hands with a length of rope from the bag, ensuring he couldn't escape. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Relief washed over them as they realized the police were finally on their way. Max sat beside Lily, his tail wagging slightly despite his exhaustion. When the officers arrived, they took the intruder into custody, praising Max for his bravery. One of them knelt down to scratch behind his ears. "You've got a real hero here," he said, smiling at Lily. "I know," she replied, hugging Max tightly. "He's the best dog in the world." But as they made their way back home, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that the quarry still held secrets. The man had been caught, but his words lingered. "You don't even know what I've been through." She glanced down at Max, who seemed more alert than ever, his ears swiveling toward the forest. Whatever lay ahead, she knew they would face it together. The following morning arrived not with relief, but with the weight of unanswered questions. The intruder had been captured, his threat silenced, but his cryptic warnings lingered in Lily's mind like a dark cloud. Max, ever vigilant, lay beside her bed, his body relaxed but his ears twitching at the faintest sound. Though they had survived the night, Lily sensed that their journey wasn't over. Downstairs, the family sat at the breakfast table in uneasy silence. The events of the past 2 days had left them shaken. Lily's father spoke in low tones to her mother, detailing the interrogation he had overheard at the police station. "He's not just some drifter," he said, his face grim. "He's been hiding out here for months, using the old quarry as his base. He's wanted for burglary and assault in 2 other states. But there's more. He He kept talking about something buried out there. Something he said would make him rich. Lily's mother frowned, her brow furrowed. Buried? What does that mean? The police think it's just rambling, her father replied. But I'm not so sure. He glanced at Lily and Max. That place. It felt wrong. Like we'd only scratched the surface of what's really out there. Lily's hand found Max's fur, her fingers curling into the soft warmth. Maybe we should find out, she said quietly. Her parents exchanged a glance. Absolutely not, her mother said firmly. We've had enough danger. Let the police handle it. But Lily couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Max seemed to share her unease, his nose twitching as if sensing something unseen. When her parents weren't looking, she slipped her arms around his neck and whispered, "We'll figure it out. Together." That afternoon, while her parents were busy discussing security measures with a contractor, Lily and Max ventured back to the edge of the woods. The quarry loomed in the distance, its jagged rocks stark against the pale winter sky. Max moved with purpose, his tail held high as he led the way. "Do you smell something, boy?" Lily asked, keeping her voice low. Max responded with a soft whine, his nose pressed to the ground. They followed him deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around them like silent sentinels. As they approached the quarry, a strange sound reached Lily's ears, a faint, rhythmic tapping. She froze, her heart racing. Max growled softly, his body tense. They crept closer, peering through the underbrush. What they saw made Lily's breath catch. A second man was at the edge of the quarry, his back to them. He was hunched over a large metal box, his hands moving frantically as he pried it open with a crowbar. The box was old and rusted, its surface etched with strange symbols. Lily's mind raced. Was this what the intruder had been searching for? Max growled again, louder this time. The man spun around, his face pale and startled. He locked eyes with Lily, his expression quickly shifting to anger. "What are you doing here?" he barked, stepping toward her. Before Lily could respond, Max sprang forward, placing himself between her and the stranger. His growl was low and menacing, his teeth bared in a fierce snarl. The man hesitated, eyeing the dog warily. "You need to leave," the man said, his voice shaking slightly. "This has nothing to do with you." "What's in the box?" Lily demanded, surprising herself with her boldness. Why was that other man looking for it? The man's eyes narrowed. "That's none of your business," he snapped. "But if you must know, it's worth more than anything you could imagine." He glanced at Max, then back at Lily. "Now go before you get hurt." Lily stood her ground, her hand on Max's collar. "We're not leaving," she said firmly. "The police are already watching this place. They'll be here any minute." The man's expression faltered, fear flickering in his eyes. He turned back to the box, muttering under his breath as he struggled to lift it. But before he could escape, Max lunged, grabbing the hem of the man's jacket and pulling him off balance. The man stumbled, falling to the ground with a grunt. The box tumbled from his grasp, landing with a heavy thud. Lily rushed forward, grabbing the crowbar and tossing it out of reach. "Stay down," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "The police will take care of this." Max stood over the man, his growl a constant warning. The man didn't dare move, his eyes darting between the dog and the box. In the distance, the sound of sirens grew louder. By the time the police arrived, the man was subdued, his hands bound with zip ties. The officers examined the box, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution. One of them opened it carefully, revealing its contents: stacks of old currency, gold coins, and what appeared to be ancient artifacts. "Looks like he stumbled onto a treasure trove," one officer remarked. "Probably hidden here decades ago." Another officer turned to Lily. "You did the right thing, calling us," he said. "And your dog. He's something special." Lily smiled, hugging Max tightly. "He's the best," she said softly. As the police secured the area and escorted the man away, Lily and Max made their way back home. The weight of the past few days began to lift, replaced by a sense of pride and gratitude. Max had protected her family, faced danger head-on, and uncovered a mystery that had remained hidden for years. That night, as Lily lay in bed with Max at her side, she whispered, "You're my hero, Max. Thank you for everything." Max wagged his tail, his amber eyes shining with devotion. For him, it wasn't about treasure or recognition. It was about the bond he shared with Lily, a bond that had proven unbreakable. As sleep claimed them both, the moon cast its light over the quiet house, a symbol of peace restored. The storm had passed, but the lessons it brought would stay with them forever. Loyalty, courage, and the unshakable love of a faithful dog, these were the treasures that truly mattered.